So we're here in Portland, Bridgetown Comedy Festival with Dave and Laura Tribble, and starting out in comedy in Seattle, I always heard about the TribbleRun. I never got to do one. Can you please explain what the TribbleRun is and what need it fills for comedy in the Northwest?
Well, the simple way to put it would be that it's boot camp. It's comedy boot camp in many respects. That is, if you're a new comic going out there, if you're a comic who just needs that extra little income to keep you going in between, or if you're a comic that sometimes needs to come back. I have more than a few comedians these days that give me a call. They got a gap in their schedule. They got some new stuff they want to try. So they've already proven themselves as to what they can do in virtually any room. So now, even though they've gone beyond the Tribble runs, they come back here to work some new stuff into their set, or get out on the road, get away from things where they can write.
Now, just from a practical standpoint, how many rooms and how many states do you have?
Well, that fluctuates almost week to week. What I can tell you is that we're keeping about probably 16 comedians a week on the road, one way or the other.
But how vast is the network, though? From
Washington, Oregon, Idaho, Montana, parts of Wyoming, northern Nevada, sometimes into Colorado, and Wyoming. I already said Wyoming.
New Mexico.
New Mexico.
So even outside the Northwest?
Yes, we're planning on expanding that. And it's amazing, too, because there's a lot of comedians who work parts of, say, Arizona, and they pick up a one-nighter in New Mexico on their way to or from, or they're heading to Texas. They're driving. So they pick up a night on their way down there.
Because I think you really speak to a facet of comedy that people don't think about unless you live out in the Great Northwest. That sure, there are comedy clubs in Seattle, there are comedy clubs in Portland, there are comedy clubs in San Francisco, Reno, but for the whole rest of the Northwest, there are people out there who don't have entertainment.
This is where this came about. I really started booking comedy in 1986 through Southern Idaho. First run put together, naturally we called it the Spud Run through Southern Idaho. But it started back in the early '85 when I was approached by another agency about bringing in some of their comedians. That concerned me because at that time, even though I booked a comedian or two for a private event, I really hadn't gotten into comedy. Into any kind of comedy routing or circuits. Okay? What I did know, though, is that the industry was changing big time. And the more I looked across country, I saw where these one-nighters were filling a void and really helping to build back some nightclubs. I wasn't in the comedy business. I was in the nightclub business. Prior to that, I was performing myself as a musician back in the 70s, most of the 70s. In the 80s, when I got into booking, is when bands actually started becoming. Well, it changed a lot with the DUIs, how it changed overnight from $3,500 for a DUI to $3,500. Excuse me, $350 up to $3,500 just overnight. It changed the whole industry. Plus, all the boomers were growing up, settling down, and not necessarily going out. They had families now. So things were changing, and I saw that to keep nightclubs going, something had to change. I dealt with DJs, I dealt with recorded music and videotapes at the time, and I saw the comedy on the rise and saw this is a way to keep the nightclubs. My focus was, what does it take to keep the nightclubs filled with patrons as entertainment was changing. So that's how I got into comedy. I spent about a year in '85 figuring out how to make it work, what would make it work, how to teach it to the clubs, how to do comedy, because it was different than any other kind of entertainment they were bringing into the clubs.
Right.
And after doing that and essentially putting down a few pages of instructions for myself as well as anybody, and just studying it for a whole year, that's when I started bringing it to the clubs and saying, how about we put something together here, bring them in one night a week and so forth. I also saw that I would need to have 4 or 5 nights at least to make it work for the comedians, as well as keep it economical for the clubs. Because they couldn't afford to just bring comedians up for one night.
Right.
It would be too expensive. In a nutshell, that's how the whole thing started.
And now, 25 years later, are things the same as they were 25 years ago? Or do you see
25 years later, sometimes I do wonder, what the hell am I still in this for? I'll tell you why I'm in it. sort of from the very beginning. It's a grassroots thing. I didn't start out as a comedian, although I did start out as an entertainer in business. And I understood comedy and how it works here. I don't tell jokes, at least I try not to. But I'm looking to bring to the clubs what they need, but I also see an industry that needs this. Early on, it was kind of easy for, that's the wrong word. That's completely the wrong word. Early on, as the industry was beginning to come on strong in the 70s and spread across the country, going from what, 2 full-time clubs or 2 part-time clubs, one in New York, one in LA. Actually just New York, and then it spread to LA. So in other words, and suddenly after a few years, there's several hundred clubs across the country. So there was a need to fill, for one thing. But secondly, there was a new industry being built here. And it was filling a purpose at just the right time. I don't know if others see it quite this way, but if you look at it, the stress level of the average worker on the street rose probably 200% back as we turned from the 70s to the 80s, went from fax machines to computers, overnight deliveries, the whole 9 yards. Business began to stress. The biggest relief for stress was comedy. That's why I think it really started to burst out the way that it did. And I saw these clubs needing a need. Here are nightclubs who have been in business for many years. All the boomers have grown up and settled down. They were the biggest group of people the country had ever seen in one, the boomer age, about a 20-year span there. And they were leaving the clubs. So suddenly these clubs that were built for 200, 300, 400 people had to scale down to 150 people. Laws were changing, everything was changing, so everything had to change. I've always focused on what does it take to make the nightclub work, and this is something that worked well for me. Kind of rambling, so.
But in terms of how comedy is today versus how it was when you started,
comedy is better today than it's ever been. I see some of those who've been in it for a long time. Oh, it's not like it used to be, blah blah blah. Well, that's because they're getting old. Just like any of us who've been in it for more than 20 years. But here's what I see. I see equality. Back when I first started booking comedy in the middle 80s, it was very tough to book women on the circuits without getting a call from some club owner or manager up in Montana, saying something like, we really like the comedy, but women aren't very funny. Well, that's bullshit. They were very funny. But what they didn't have, the guys have always had, men have always had along the way, are mentors. There's been more and more coming along. Now, for both men and women, the quality of comic today, in their early stages, in my opinion, far surpasses, percentage-wise, the same quality 20 years ago. Damn good comedians came up 20 years ago, obviously, and the cream rose to the top pretty fast. But these days, it's a tougher competition. But they've had a lot of mentors, and a lot of, even though there's a lot that really will try it out, unfortunately, they'll go away. Mm-hmm. There's many who have done well and have learned from their peers of the past, or I should say not their peers, but their mentors. Whether they met them or not, what they learned from just about. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. I really appreciate your time. It's a pleasure to meet you both.